Welcome back to the Calculated Risk Podcast. I am Tyler Shoemaker, joined as always by Kelley Ford, and week 12 is behind us. We're going to quickly get through, we're going to talk about how what we saw on the field impacted our resume and most deserving rankings. First and foremost, we're going to kind of flip the structure of the show starting this week. We're going to talk about the resumes more because we both feel like that's more what you guys want to hear about. That's what the topic of conversation is, regarding the committee and things like that. Understanding where these teams stack up from a resume standpoint and who may or may not get into the college football playoff and what bowls teams are going to be going to, that sort of thing. And then we'll touch on our power ratings at the end. But as we mentioned here over the last couple of weeks, not huge changes in our power ratings at this point. So, we don't want to get super redundant. So we're going to go through our resume rankings here. Again, there wasn't much chaos yesterday. Washington survived a scare in Corvallis. Credit to them, which we'll get into them here in just a second because that actually was extremely meaningful, at least especially in my numbers. But Kelley, what were your any initial thoughts on Week 12 here before we get into our resume rankings?
Yeah, the thing that stood out to me the most, and it's related to the resume rankings, Tyler, was Georgia. They had a really good opportunity to improve their resume, and they did that against Tennessee, a highly power-rated team. And as we talked about, that's how you improve your resume, is by beating teams that have high power ratings. I don't care what the committee has a team ranked. I know that's how the committee values it, but it's interesting, Tyler, because let's use Kansas State, for example, who's also a team that's up a few spots in my most deserving rankings that we're going to get to. Kansas State beats a top 25 committee ranked Kansas team. Kansas was number 25 last week. So, hey, that's a good win, at least by the committee standards. Well, this week, since you were 25 last week and you lost, even though you lost to a team ranked higher than you, I don't think Kansas is going to be ranked by the committee. So all of a sudden, that quote ranked win that Kansas State got, that's no longer a ranked win. And essentially that's like, oh, well, okay, I guess it's a win over a team with a 500 or better record, which is a term that keeps getting thrown around this year. I feel like more than years past. So that's still good, I guess, from the committee standpoint. But that ranked win that Kansas State you earned against Kansas, because you beat them, they're now out of the top 25. It's just one of the kind of quirks that I have with how the committee does their rankings. And so to me, the biggest takeaway is ranked wins. Again, not a good way to judge a resume. And Georgia definitely improved theirs. We're going to see that here in a second of how far they moved up for me.
Yeah, Georgia. I mean, we've been talking about them here for the last 3 or 4 weeks. As like, okay, we know they're coming, but the metrics just haven't been there. The metrics are starting to get there. They're climbing. I think our power ratings, our resume rankings. Georgia's starting to round into the form that we thought they would, in the preseason. So it's good to see them coming into form and just destroying everyone. So with that, let's transition to our resume most deserving rankings. If you're watching on YouTube, we've got the graphics up. Kelley, we were talking here before we recorded. We've got the same top 5. Well, we have the same top 7 in some order. So for me, I've had Ohio State number 1 the last couple of weeks. Washington's win in Corvallis was enough for them to jump from 4 to 1 because those teams are so close. Again, the rating in between those is very small, very, very small distinction there. But they did jump up to number 1 in the resume rankings, with Ohio State number 2, Michigan number 3, obviously going to play this week, Georgia number 4, Florida State 5, Texas 6, and Alabama 7 for me. You have the same 7 teams, just in a different order.
Yeah, I've still got Ohio State number 1. They've been there since the Penn State win, and they continue to have the most impressive combination of resume, record achievement, and then also relative scoring margin. How bad are they beating their opponents? Michigan, for the second straight week, remains number 2 for me. Georgia, I talked about them at the Open. They are now my number 3 team. They are finally up there. They have not been in the top 4 for me from a deservedness standpoint all year. They are now number 3. Not a big opportunity this week against Georgia Tech for them to continue to improve. But of course, Alabama, a very highly power-rated team, a team I have power-rated number 6, awaiting in Atlanta. As I've said all year, if Georgia finishes the year 13-0, they will be not only in my top 4, but most likely number 1 or number 2. I don't know where they'll end up in deservedness. Honestly, with how close the gap is right now between them and Ohio State at 1, If Michigan beats Ohio State, I could see Georgia end up being number 1 if they're 13-0. If Ohio State beats Michigan and then wins the Big Ten, Ohio State probably holds on to that 1 spot for me. But either way, Georgia's a top 2 minimum team for me in the most deserving if they continue to win. Washington hangs on to number 4. So Georgia jumped up from number 6 to number 3. Washington held steady, though. That means somebody from my top 4 moved down. That would be Florida State. They were number 3. They are now number 5. It's you played North Alabama, and they were down 13-0 when Travis got hurt.
Jordan
but then
Travis,
they continued to demolish North Alabama after that. But beating an FCS team at this stage doesn't do a whole lot to improve your resume. And when Georgia beats Tennessee and Washington beats Oregon State, both those games on the road for those teams, that improves their resume significantly at this point. So Florida State falls to number 5. I've got Alabama at 6 and Texas at 7. It's hard to see in the graphic, but each of those teams have a raw, most deserving rating, if you will, of 0.979. They are tied to the 1,000th. I would not have any problem at all. People want to flip that because Texas won that game head-to-head. Again, they're like so close, it's not even funny. But that's what I have. That's what's the number spit out. Alabama 6 and Texas 7 to round out the same top 7 that you have, just in a different order, Tyler.
Yeah, a couple of things that I think are worth talking about here. One being Florida State. I mean, they lose Jordan Travis. Thank God I wasn't watching. Leg injuries like make me queasy. I wasn't actually watching. I just saw on Twitter, and I haven't, gone to YouTube or anything to look at it. I just know from what I read, it was a gruesome injury. But so, obviously we hope he's okay long term and all of that. But from a football standpoint, at this point, I don't know what that's going to mean for Florida State. Like, they play Florida this week. Obviously, they're only favored by 6 right now, which is very interesting. I make the line, with a healthy Jordan Travis, I make the line like 16.5. I would assume he's worth about 7 points. So I think that line should be more like 9 or so. But my point is, Florida's not, they showed against Missouri, they're not dead. You got to show up and play against them. And then they're going to play Louisville in the ACC championship. And without Jordan Travis, I don't know how Florida State's going to escape these next 2 games unscathed. So very interested to see that. And then, we mentioned the razor thin margin in resume between Alabama and Texas. There's a scenario where those 2 teams are in the discussion for like a final spot, depending on how all this shakes out. How's the committee going to view 2 very, very similar resumes? Texas has the head-to-head win all the way back in week 2. Me personally, I would make that the tiebreaker, but I'm very curious to see what the committee would do there with those teams. And I have Texas ahead of Alabama, and that actually was not a manual, flip. That actually is just how the numbers shook out. So obviously they're very, very close. So I'm very interested in those 2 storylines. How does Florida State navigate these next 2 games? And also, how does the committee, if Florida State does manage to, maybe they lose to Florida and then win the ACC, like how does that shake out? How does the committee weigh the fact they're not going to have Jordan Travis presumably, and then the Alabama-Texas head-to-head thing if it comes to that? So that's what jumps out to me here at the very top of the rankings, Kelly.
Yeah, my reaction to that, Tyler, and of course we're going to find out all those things. But I'll take the scenario you said last. If Florida State loses to Florida and then wins the ACC, of course it depends what happens in the other conference races. Florida State is not going to have a very strong resume in terms of like relative comparisons here with the other contenders, I don't think, for one of those final spots. Like right now I have them number 5, and now you're going to say, well, they're going to lose a game and then go on to beat Louisville. Like, I don't think they're probably in a position as a 1-loss conference champion where they're looking favorably compared to an Alabama, a Texas, an Oregon, any of those teams that are currently behind them, just nipping at their heels. So I don't think Florida State can afford to lose a game. We will see. If they finish 13-0, I think they're certainly in. If they do lose a game, injuries do become a part of the conversation in the committee room as well. And they're going to say, well, they don't have their quarterback. That's another downgrade that the committee is going to give them. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that's the way it's going to go in that room. The other one with Alabama and Texas, Tyler, I'm with you. Like at the end of the day, and I know I say I'll flip teams, in my own personal ranking outside of what the model's saying or the numbers are saying on head-to-head if no other teams are affected throughout the year. At the end of the year, I have a very strong stance that head-to-head should matter if the resumes are comparable. And I'll say again, as I've said all year, if they're right next to each other, they should be flipped, because otherwise, why are we playing these games? And they said, well, people say, well, Kelley, now you're doubling down on that because that's already accounted for. I understand. And I'm okay making a manual human adjustment to say playing these games matters. Yes, this game is already accounted for in the resumes. Yes, that's why the numbers are spitting out what they are. Is overall, Alabama, by my numbers right now, has a very, very, very slightly more impressive resume in the things that I'm looking at. But that game happened in Tuscaloosa, and I don't care that it was in week 2. We're crowning a champion for 2023. The whole season. It started in August for some teams. We're not crowning a champion in November and December. So that's how I would answer those things. To me, Tyler, the thing that I'm interested in the most at the top of mind, and the committees for that matter, what if Ohio State loses? I think if Michigan loses to Ohio State, I don't. Again, it depends. It depends on everything else. But I don't think Michigan has the resume, and they've been behind Ohio State in the committee's rankings. I expect them to be this week again. I don't expect the top 3 to change this week. I do expect Washington to be number 4 for the committee this week. I expect they're going to jump Florida State. But Michigan's been behind Ohio State the whole time. If they lose this game at home, their only losses to Ohio State, a really, really good team who presumably is going to be in the CFP then, having just Iowa left in the Big Ten championship game. That's going to be, what, a 3-score spread? I mean, it's going to be north of 17 points, maybe 21. So let's assume they win. I'm most interested in what is the committee going to do if Ohio State were to lose to Michigan, and how are my numbers going to react? Because I'm not convinced, Tyler, that Ohio State next week at 11-1 with the resume they have, and then you add a loss on the road to Michigan, my number 1 power rated team, I'm honestly not convinced that they drop out of the top 4. Maybe because the Florida State win, if Florida State beats Florida, maybe that's just enough to edge Ohio State down to that number 5 spot. But I don't know. So I'm curious to see what the committee does there. What do they do with the loser of Ohio State, Michigan, particularly if it is Ohio State? So that's probably the biggest thing that I'm looking forward to. And again, we're going to find out the answer to all these things. The committee has never, since I've been doing the most deservings, they've never gotten the top 4 wrong. They've never gotten them out of order. I'm starting to get a little nervous about a potential scenario where I think they might end up getting it wrong by my numbers. You could make the case from a power rating standpoint, but from a resume standpoint, I'm getting a little nervous at the team at number 8 for me. The committee has it number 6. That's Oregon. They've got opportunities to improve their resume. Oregon State this weekend, Washington in the Pac-12 championship game if they get there. They could end up, sniffing my top 4, but right now they're ways down there. There's quite a gap from 7 to 8 for me. That's a team that's making me a little nervous that the committee is just in love with. And I get it from a power rating standpoint, but if we're just doing power ratings again, let's just ask Vegas and we'll put those teams in. So we'll see. There's a lot to be determined here in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and Oregon was the next team that I wanted to touch on. I think that's probably the last conversation point here in the top 10 on these. But Oregon, I mean, to put it in perspective, with my numbers at least, their average opponent power rating is -3. For context, Washington's is 2.1, Ohio State's is 1.3, Texas is 4.5. So again, Oregon -3. So well off of those teams. Oregon's strength of schedule is more in line with Tulane at -4.7 or Troy at -3.7. That's the type of schedule that Oregon's played according to my numbers. So that's what we're talking about here, and why, from a power rating perspective, we get it. They're really high for both of us. From a resume standpoint, at this point, again, and they could add 2 more really good wins to the resume, which would really bolster that. But as it stands, they have not put together the body of work near what these other teams have. All right, anything else here that you wanted to touch on with the most deserving rankings, Kelley?
I mean, I can't
Before we
let
get
you
into
out
our
of here.
power rating updates.
I can't let you off here, Tyler, without you mentioning who you've got at number 8. You got Liberty at number 8. Give me something on Liberty here. I've got the Flames up to number 18, so they're up 3 spots for me. But you've got them up at number 8. I got to hear it. What's going on with Liberty for you that has them that high?
The crazy thing is, I've obviously been high on them all year. I mean, even in the preseason, I talked about Liberty, but they have continued to cover spreads. I know they ended up getting backdoored this week by UMass, but I mean, they were covering that game pretty much the whole game. I mean, they cover these huge spreads. So they still have been outperforming expectations almost every week. And what makes me mad is I haven't bet on them in a month, because I had bet on them for like 3 straight weeks, cash tickets on them, and then I'm like, all right, they're going to regress. Like at some point, my numbers are just going to get way too ahead of itself, and they're going to regress, and then they just don't. So they have continued to even outperform my model's high expectations for them for the most part. So, from an average opponent power rating standpoint, -7, which is by far the worst in the top 10. It's the worst until you get down to Toledo at number 18. Toledo has a -8.6 average opponent power rating. But again, my formula really penalizes you for losing, and they haven't lost, and their margin of victory is really good. I mean, they crush teams. So that's the story on Liberty.
I love it. No, I wanted to hear it because I know if people are looking at it, they might say, what's going on at Liberty at number 8? But outside of that, I mean, our top 10, largely the same. You've got Louisville in there at number 9. Louisville for me is number 12. So the two teams I have in the top 10 that you don't, Ole Miss at 9, Missouri at 10. You've got those teams 11 and 12. So, yeah, not a whole lot. It looks like the biggest discrepancy on my end is I have Utah at 20. You don't have them in your top 30 at all. And as we talked about numerous times this year, Tyler, I mean, I'm looking at your list. You've got Liberty, James Madison, Toledo, Troy, UNLV, SMU, Miami of Ohio, all G5 teams in your top 30 here. A lot of those teams for me, lurking in the 30s, in the 40s. But in terms of who from the G5 do I have in my top 30? For me, it's Liberty at number 18, James Madison at number 21. They were all the way up at number 12 last week, but the loss in overtime to App State, they're down to 21. Tulane's at 23, and that's the extent of my G5s in the top 30 right now. But again, I've got some more of those that you have listed just outside there. But that's the big thing for me. At LSU, I should note my highest 3-loss team at number 14. They are down a spot this week. It was interesting, a couple of weeks ago, people were saying you can't be having these 2-loss teams, these 3-loss teams as high as you do. Well, those teams, the ones that I got called out for or questioned on, they haven't really moved up too far. They've kind of hung where they were or slightly regressed even. And now no one really complains, I don't think, about where I have them because they're like, oh, yeah, well, it's okay now later in the year. And to me, like, it's just such a flawed approach to just say, well, you can't have a team that has 3 losses at number 14 if we haven't even hit November. Like okay, like that's a okay rule of thumb, I guess, from a generality standpoint, but let's evaluate what those 3 losses were and let's take a look at
Right.
those. And so that's all I'm asking people to do is really think critically about the resume that's in front of you without looking at the win and loss alone. Dive deeper into that and say, okay, who did they beat? Who did they lose to? Where were those games? By how many points did they win? Did they lose? Like the numbers tell a story. If you just dive in and educate yourself on it, I think people can understand why they're telling the story they are. Too often people look at it, see the logo, see the number in the loss column and say, oh, nope, that's biased. That's too high. Just get it out of here. And so it's unfortunate, but we'll keep working on it. Yeah, that's LSU, Kansas State, Notre Dame, Arizona, all 14, 15, 16, 17, 3-loss teams for me. Utah 7-4 at number 20. I'll say my numbers are like in Utah. They're the beneficiary of an approach that I have where you get max credit for every single game. The power rating of your opponent at the time you played, or the power rating of your opponent that they currently have. Whichever one's greater, that's what you get credit for. Utah earlier in the year played some teams that had better power ratings than they do now, and they are getting credit for those wins at the time that those teams had those power ratings, not what they're looking like today, which is why Utah continues to be up at number 20, even though they're 7-4 on the year for me.
Yeah, I've got Tennessee and Utah at 31 and 32, just outside the graphic here. So not too far off there. And you mentioned James Madison for me. I mean, so to put in perspective, like I had them, my numbers are higher on G5 teams, so their average opponent power rating is going to be higher in my numbers than they are in yours. But like James Madison was in my top 10 last week. I think they got as high as like number 7 or 8 last week. But then a loss, drops them all the way to 16. So, losses are very costly in my formula. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else you touched on there that I wanted to add to. You mentioned LSU being your top ranked 3-loss team. I actually have them below Oklahoma State and Kansas State from a resume standpoint, but LSU is my highest power rated 3-loss team. Not that I factor that in, but I just took a peek at my power ratings and saw that. But I think that'll be a good stopping point here on the resume rankings. We'll touch on our updated power ratings here real quick. Maybe we'll just go through look at our top 10, see who may be on the rise or falling a little bit here at the end as we project forward. So for me, I've still got Michigan number one. The gap between 1 and 2 though has gotten smaller. I think it was 5 points last week. It's now about 3.5. To Oregon at number 2, Ohio State number 3. I've still got Penn State power rated number 4 just because and I've caught so much crap for that. But the problem is, like, yes, I know that everyone just looks at their big games against Ohio State and Michigan, and their offense didn't do anything in either of those games. But the problem is, against everybody else, they've dominated. I mean, with the exception of the Indiana game right after the Ohio State game, they have absolutely like lit everybody else up. So like their metrics are, and I've admitted this, their metrics are inflated. As you try to project what they would do against some of these top teams, even with opponent adjustment and all of that, like they're still pretty inflated. And I certainly admit that here. I've got them a 10th of a point ahead of Georgia, who's number 5 for me. Notre Dame number 6, Oklahoma finally dropping down for me, number 7, but still 0.2 of a point above Alabama at number 8, LSU number 9, and Florida State number 10. Interesting there, LSU now ahead of Florida State by a half a point. Obviously we know Florida State beat them earlier in the year, but LSU's playing great right now. I mean, obviously, especially on offense, Jaden Daniels is unbelievable. But so that's my top 10 and my updated power ratings.
My top 16, Tyler, remain unchanged in terms of the composition of teams. I had 4 instances within the top 16 where 2 teams just flipped one spot. Number 1 remains the same. It's Michigan for me. They've been there for over a month now. Ohio State remains number 2. Here's my first flop. I have Georgia now up to number 3, passing Oregon, who falls to number 4. Both of these teams' power rating actually improved. Georgia's improved more. They closed the gap and passed the Ducks. For me, Georgia now up to number 3, the highest they've been since starting the year, number 1 in the power ratings. Hey, you don't have to defend Penn State to me. I've got them sitting there at number 5 still, Tyler. I catch grief for them as well, and I agree with your sentiments on them. I've got Alabama at 6. You and I are in line on Oklahoma now. Both of us have them number 7. I've got LSU above Florida State as well. This is my second flip. LSU's number 8, Florida State number 9. Both these teams though have a power rating of 21.4, so they are tied to the 10th. It's broken as you go out farther than that. And then I've got Texas, who held on to number 10. Another team you mentioned in your top 10 was Notre Dame. I have them 11th. They flopped with Kansas State. Kansas State fell to 12 this week. Washington fans are mad at me. I have them number 13. They were 13 last week. They remain 13. They actually fell 0.1 of a rating. I even had someone like DM me, Washington won. You said they're not very good. Well, no, actually, that's incorrect. I did not say that Washington wasn't very good. And I hit him back with a screenshot of my dashboard that actually had Washington as a 2-point favorite in a game that Vegas had them as an underdog. I didn't get a response back to that one. So for Washington fans that are mad, I'm sorry that the model is not as high on your team as you'd like it to be. It reminds me of TCU last year a little bit. Same deal. A really good resume. I had TCU as the number 3 team in the resumes at the end of last year, right where the committee did. But I had them power rated, number 9 or number 10, I want to say. Washington, number 4 in the deserving rankings. They're number 13 in the power ratings. Listen, Washington fans, you're going to get your chance. You're going to be favored this week in the Apple Cup, which great news on the Apple Cup today that they're continuing that series. That's fantastic. In all sincerity, I'm very, very excited about that. And then you're going to get a chance against most likely Oregon. We'll see. It's not finalized yet, but if you beat Oregon, you're going to have earned your spot. No doubt about it. You will be in the playoff. My numbers will suggest you'll be in the playoff, and you'll open as an underdog against whoever you're playing. It doesn't like any other contender. You will open as an underdog, just as TCU did, and TCU went out and beat Michigan in what was a great game. So I'm not even saying I won't be rooting for you to win your semifinal, depending on who you're playing. If you're not playing my team, then yeah, sure, I'll be rooting for you because it's a great story. I love Penix and what the offense is doing. But from a power rating standpoint, like, I'm sorry that that's the way it is. And so I've got Washington 13, Texas A&M still 14, and then my other flip, 15 is Ole Miss, now 16 is Tennessee. So top 16, same teams, 4 flips with 1 spot. That's it. As we talked about, Tyler, you just don't get a lot of change in the power ratings this deep into the year. Auburn, can we talk about Auburn for a second? Losing at home to New Mexico State. What a story New Mexico State has been this year. Like that's a whole nother segment.
Yeah.
Auburn falls 2.6 points in my power ratings after losing at home as I want to say like a 21-point favorite or something like that to a New Mexico State team who is not nearly as talented as Auburn. But that just goes to show you 2.6, like that movement's almost nothing when you're talking about weeks 2, weeks 3, weeks 4. That's a big drop when you're talking about week 12 to week 13. So that's why you don't see a lot of movement in the rankings of the ordinal ranks, because there's just not a lot of movement in the ratings because these teams have really settled into who they are at this point.
Yep. 2 final thoughts here. One, I 100% agree with Washington. I've got them number 14. They did increase their rating by 0.2 after the win. So
what do you have them? What's their rating?
15.7.
Okay, I'm 18.2. So Washington fans, anyone who's mad at me, take that anger and go over to Tyler because he's got you a spot lower and a field goal worse. So Washington fans, get out of my DMs, get out of my comments, go on over to Tyler and check him out. Geez, I just can't believe I'm catching so much heat from Washington fans. I'm like, guys, just be happy. You're having a great year, and my most deserving is reflecting that. Hey, use it as motivation. Okay, Ford says we stink. 1, I don't. But 2, sure, go for it. Like, put it on the bulletin board. If Kalen DeBoer is talking about the K Ford ratings, I win.
Right. Yeah, you can come yell at me about the power rating, but I do have them number 1 on my resume ranking. So,
shoot. Yeah, you got me on that one.
That's conflicting. All right. I think that'll do it for us here for this week 12 recap. We will be back. I don't want to promise a day because it's Thanksgiving week. We'll be back this week to talk about week 13, the game, Iron Bowl, Egg Bowl, all of it. We'll be back to talk about all that later this week. Make sure you get subscribed on YouTube to the Saturday Glory channel. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you follow him on X at KFord Ratings. I am at TShoeIndex. For Kelley Ford, I'm Tyler Shoemaker, and that was Calculated Risk.